Have you ever meticulously planned a project, mapped out every single step, color-coded the spreadsheet, only to have the entire situation change the absolute minute you started?
Oh, yeah. Like, immediately.
Right. You know that feeling of your perfect plan just evaporating. Now, I want you to imagine that exact feeling, but instead of like a marketing launch or a kitchen renovation, national security is on the line.
It is a terrifying premise, honestly. But I mean, that is the baseline reality of modern strategic operations. We all have this deep-seated psychological desire for things to be predictable,
Yeah,
right?
of course, we want the world to make sense.
Exactly. We want the world to behave like a vending machine. You put the coin in, you press the button, you get the expected outcome.
A clear diagnosis, like it's either broken or not broken. You follow the checklist and you get the result.
And that traditional linear planning, it works remarkably well for predictable problems. But contemporary threats, they operate on a completely different frequency. We are talking about, weaponized mass migration, highly coordinated terrorism.
Hybrid warfare, right?
Right, hybrid warfare where state actors use proxies. Those types of threats, they do not care about a defensive checklist. They require an entirely different metaphysics, like a total shift in how organizations even perceive reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're looking at two really fascinating academic articles by researcher Petri Blomval, and they detail context-dependent processes in defense design.
Yeah, heavily researched stuff.
Super dense, but incredible. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore how top-tier military and security ecosystems tackle these impossible large-scale threats.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, they don't do it by just planning harder.
No, definitely not.
They do it by completely changing how they think. But before we can understand why traditional planning fails in modern security, we need a map of reality itself. We have to figure out what kind of problem we are actually looking at before we try to solve it.
Right, and Blomval's research anchors this in a conceptual tool called the Cinefin framework.
Cinefin, right?
Yeah, think of Cinefin as a sense-making model. It basically categorizes the reality you're operating in based on the relationship between cause and effect. So it divides the world into 4 domains. You've got simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic.
Let's walk through those because mapping this out totally changed how I look at my own daily problems, whether that's managing a team or just navigating a really chaotic week.
Yeah, it's super applicable everywhere. So we can start with the structured side of the framework, the domains where order actually exists. First, you have the simple domain. This is the realm of best practices, standard operating procedures. The cause and effect are totally clear and visible to everyone. If X happens, you do Y.
Like a call center routing a standard tech support issue, or, I don't know, a fast food kitchen assembling a burger.
Perfect examples.
Right.
Then you step up a level of difficulty into the complicated domain. This
Yep.
is the domain of experts. There are multiple causes and effects, and they might not be immediately obvious to a layperson, but they are knowable. You can analyze them. Think of engineering a suspension bridge or organizing the logistics for a massive political summit.
So really hard but solvable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need a team of experts and incredibly detailed blueprints. But if you do the math right, the bridge will stand.
Because the laws of physics aren't going to just change halfway through the construction.
Right.
So in both the simple and complicated domains, traditional linear planning is highly effective. You can essentially freeze the situation, analyze it, build a timeline, and execute.
Yeah, that ability to freeze the environment is the luxury of order. But then we cross the border into the unordered side of the framework. In the complex domain, cause and effect are totally unpredictable beforehand.
Unpredictable.
Totally. You cannot freeze a complex situation to analyze it because the very act of intervening changes the problem itself. The interconnectedness is so high that unexpected things just constantly emerge.
The sources bring up Nokia to illustrate this perfectly, which I loved. They had the absolute best practices for mobile phone buttons. They absolutely dominated the simple and complicated domains of manufacturing a phone. But then
The touchscreen.
the touchscreen arrived. And it wasn't just a new engineering challenge. It was a complex disruption that changed consumer behavior, app ecosystems, the entire definition of what a phone was. Their perfect buttons were instantly obsolete.
Yeah.
Or look at Blockbuster. I mean, they optimized the VHS rental model down to a science, but streaming just destroyed the underlying reality of their business.
And when we look at the security realm, the stakes of misdiagnosing a complex problem as a complicated one are, well, they're severe. Blomval uses the example of the rapid 2014 Russian takeover of Crimea,
Oh, right.
or the sudden, highly coordinated Bataclan theater terrorist attacks in Paris. These weren't situations where a military commander could just sit back and run a standard analysis. The operational environment was pushed straight out of the complicated realm.
And sometimes they bypass complex entirely and fall into the fourth domain,
Right.
right? Chaotic.
Oh, absolutely.
This is where there is absolutely no visible relationship between cause and effect.
None at all. In the chaotic domain, your only goal is survival. You cannot plan. A commander cannot draft a strategy when the fundamental rules of the environment are collapsing around them.
So what do you do?
You just have to act immediately. You triage the bleeding, lock down the building, whatever it takes to establish some sort of order. The goal is to drag the situation out of chaos and back into the complex domain, where you can at least start probing the system, sensing what is actually going on.
Let me try an analogy here to see if I'm grasping the mechanical difference between these domains.
Sure, go for it.
So traditional linear planning, like operating in a complicated domain, is like following a very intricate recipe to bake a massive, multi-tiered wedding cake. You need expertise, precise measurements, a clear timeline, you follow the steps, you get the cake.
Because the ingredients are static and the oven temperature is a known variable.
Right. But operating in a complex environment is like being asked to cook a meal in a kitchen where the ingredients are constantly morphing. You turn your back, and the flour is turned into sand. The oven changes temperature on its own.
That sounds like a nightmare.
And on top of all that, someone is actively running around the kitchen trying to steal your pots and pans while you cook.
Huh. Okay, that detail about someone stealing your pots and pans, that captures the central friction of defense design perfectly. It really highlights why war and national security are fundamentally different from commercial business strategy.
How so?
Well, in business, the market might be complex and unpredictable, sure, but the market isn't actively, maliciously trying to kill you. In security, you are dealing with what the source material calls hostile reciprocity.
Hostile reciprocity,
Yeah, but-
meaning the enemy gets a vote.
Exactly. You are facing an adversary who is intentionally creating chaos to paralyze your decision-making process. The famous military strategist John Boyd talked about this as a tempo-based struggle.
Tempo.
Yeah, the adversary tries to move, adapt, and change the rules of the game so quickly that your ability to make sense of the world just shatters. They want to force you into that chaotic domain so you can't even mount a coherent defense.
So if the enemy is intentionally breaking your reality, traditional linear planning is, it's worse than useless. It's a liability. You are executing a beautifully colored spreadsheet for a world that ceased to exist 10 minutes ago.
Right.
So how did military institutions, which are, famous for loving spreadsheets and rigid doctrines, how did they actually adapt to this?
They had to look outside the military completely, actually. In the 1990s, a retired Israeli brigadier general named Shimon Naver realized that traditional operational art was just failing against these dynamic, irregular threats.
Okay.
So he developed a methodology called systemic operational design, or SOD. And to build it, he combined military strategy with fields you would never expect to see in a war room. He brought in architecture, systems theory, and postmodern philosophy.
I have to pause you there because I'm struggling to see the reality of this.
I know, it sounds crazy.
When a commander is taking fire and a region is collapsing, how do they justify sitting in a room discussing postmodern philosophy? Doesn't this level of abstraction cost lives when time is of the essence? Militaries are about strict orders and reducing ambiguity, not debating the nature of truth.
It sounds totally absurd on the surface, I agree. But we have to separate the tactical level from the operational and strategic levels.
Okay, that makes sense.
The soldier taking fire on the ground absolutely needs a checklist and immediate tactical responses, but the general who sent them there, they need to understand why the conflict is happening. What's fascinating here is that military structures realize that if the enemy is successfully changing the paradigm of the war, fighting harder using the old paradigm just gets more of your soldiers killed faster.
Oh, wow. So you have to step back.
Right. Nava understood that an architect designing a city space isn't just solving a math equation. They are anticipating human behaviors, cultural shifts, futures that don't exist yet. They are designing an environment.
They are looking at the invisible forces shaping the physical ones.
Exactly. Planning is about efficiency and best practices. Design is about creating something entirely new when the old practices fail, and we actually have a highly documented proof of concept for this.
Really?
Yeah, in 2005, the U.S. military ran this massive war game exercise called Unified Quest. They pitted their traditional military planners who were using the standard military decision-making process, which is highly linear.
Very step-by-step.
Right. They pitted them against a team of just 6 students who were trained in NAVA's systemic operational design.
6 students going up against the entrenched military machine in a complex simulation. How does that even work mechanically?
Well, the traditional planners approached the complex simulation by looking for enemy nodes to destroy. They diagnosed the problem as, we need to defeat this military force, and they optimized a plan to do that.
Makes sense for a military planner.
Sure, but the 6 students using SOD didn't start by looking at targets. They zoomed all the way out and asked, why are we even here? What is the underlying political and social instability actually driving this conflict? They reframed the entire problem.
Wow.
They realized this simulation wasn't a military problem at all. It was a socio-political problem that required a completely different operational approach. They completely outmaneuvered the traditional planners, adapting to the simulated threat so effectively that the concept of design thinking immediately started spreading to the U.S. Army, NATO, allied forces, everywhere.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. It is one thing to say, think like an architect or reframe the problem. It's another thing to actually execute that in a room full of stressed-out security officials who just want to bomb a target.
Very true.
Blomvoll's research opens up the actual toolbox these defense design teams use, and they rely on 2 very different but complementary schools of thought: human-centered design and postmodern design.
We can break those down. Starting with human-centered design, or HCD. This approach is widely used in the corporate and tech worlds. A core mechanical component of HCD is the double diamond process.
The double diamond.
Yeah, it's a visual framework that forces a team to explicitly separate 2 distinct types of thinking: divergent thinking and convergent thinking.
The first diamond is entirely about framing the problem. Right. You start at a single point and you diverge. You go wide.
Exactly.
The rule is you do not jump to conclusions. You bring in multidisciplinary teams. You look at data, but you heavily index on empathy. You try to view the system from the perspective of the civilians on the ground, the local government, maybe even the adversary.
You are intentionally forcing your brain to expand its perspective to bypass your own institutional bias. You gather all this messy qualitative data, and then once you have truly explored the boundaries of the environment, then you converge.
You narrow it down.
Right. You funnel all that diverse information down into a very specific reframed definition of the actual problem you need to solve.
And once you actually know what the problem is, you enter the second diamond. The solution phase. You diverge again, brainstorming wild ideas, building rough prototypes, just throwing unconventional concepts at the wall.
Getting creative.
Yeah. And finally, you converge one last time to select a feasible, testable solution. It's a structured way to force innovation.
And human-centered design is incredibly effective for creating better solutions through group creativity and empathy. But Blomvoll's research highlights a really important limitation. HCD assumes a baseline level of good faith, or at least a neutral environment.
Right, but what if it's not neutral?
When you are facing radical, intentional disruption by an enemy, when the hostile reciprocity is off the charts, empathy might not be enough to break your own deeply ingrained paradigms. For that, you need the postmodern approach.
This brings us back to Shimon Neve's systemic operational design, the heavy intellectual framework.
It is incredibly demanding. Practitioners actually describe it as structured storming. It relies on brutal critical reflection and uses 7 specific discourses to force the planning team to shatter their own mental models.
The sources mention a couple of these discourses. There is rival as rationale and command as rationale.
Yeah.
Walk me through how a team actually uses these in a room, like practically.
Okay, so if a team engages in the rival as rationale discourse, they aren't just doing a standard threat assessment. They must construct the internal logic of the enemy's worldview. They have to argue why the enemy's actions make perfect sense to the enemy.
Oh, so you can't just say they're crazy.
Exactly. It strips away the comforting idea that the adversary is just irrational. And command as rationale is even more uncomfortable. It requires the team to critically examine their own leadership and bureaucratic structure.
That sounds dangerous for career advancement.
Yeah. They have to ask, is our own chain of command physically incapable of understanding this threat because of how we are organized?
So they have to assume that their initial perception of the conflict might be a complete illusion. The text actually brings in the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard here, leaning on his concept of hyperreality and his controversial essays on the Gulf War.
Yeah, Baudrillard's core argument about the Gulf War was that the public's perception of it was a simulation. It was heavily mediated by television screens, smart bomb footage, strategic military
And it
communication.
wasn't the reality of war.
No, the reality of the sand and blood was replaced by a sterile, mediated hyperreality. Postmodern design takes that deep philosophical skepticism and applies it directly to military intelligence.
It's a mechanism for doubt.
A very structured doubt. A design team uses this to ask, is the intelligence feed we are looking at showing us the actual reality on the ground, or are we looking at a simulacrum? Has the enemy constructed a massive, fake troop buildup to trick our sensors, forcing us to react to a hyper-reality while they slip through the back door?
Wow.
It forces the commander to acknowledge that their dashboard might be straight up lying to them.
So human-centered design is the tool for collaborative, empathetic problem solving. And postmodern design is the tool for shattering illusions when you've been strategically surprised. And the physical methods they use to run these discourses are wild.
Very unconventional.
They don't just sit and talk. They deliberately force generals and planners to draw conceptual maps, sketch visual representations, build narratives. Why do they do that?
Well, there is a real cognitive mechanism behind that. If you ask a military professional to write a standard bulleted report, their brain automatically routes that task through standard linear neural pathways. They will give you standard linear thinking.
Because naming is framing. If you don't change the language or the medium, you can't escape the paradigm.
Exactly. Forcing a strategic commander to pick up a whiteboard marker and draw a conceptual map of how an insurgency's financial network connects to local religious grievances, it forces them out of their comfort zone. It physically prevents them from falling back on boilerplate military doctrine.
Okay, so we have this incredible toolbox available. We have traditional linear checklists for simple problems. We have expert engineering and planning for the complicated. We have human-centered design for empathetic innovation in complex environments. And we have postmodern structured storming to shatter illusions when chaos is looming.
That's the toolkit.
But a toolbox is totally useless if you don't know which tool to grab.
Which brings us to the crux of Blomval's argument. He introduces a critical concept called the meta-decision.
The decision about the decision.
Precisely. Before a security ecosystem, a corporate board, or a government agency even attempts to solve a problem, they must stop. They have to engage in a metaphase where they decide how to think about the problem. You pull up the Sinefin framework and you ask the room, what domain are we actually in?
You don't just blindly pull the standard operating procedure manual off the shelf just because it's, what you did last quarter.
Exactly. If you do the analysis and realize the environment is simple or complicated, you absolutely use traditional planning. It is efficient, it is proven, and it works. But if you realize the situation is novel, highly complex, rapidly mutating, or politically charged,
You lock the SOP manual in a drawer.
you deploy the design teams. You use the double diamond or the structured postmodern discourses.
This is where the rubber meets the road for you, listening right now. You might not be planning a multinational defense operation or dealing with hostile state actors, but look at your own work environment. Look at your own life.
It applies everywhere.
Applying a linear, step-by-step checklist to a complex, emotionally charged team conflict at your office will fail just as spectacularly as applying an SOP to hybrid warfare. You cannot spreadsheet your way out of a complex human problem. You have to match your cognitive tool to the reality of the environment you are actually standing in.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of organizational health, the meta decision is ultimately about resource management. Cognitive energy is finite.
That's so true.
Design thinking, whether it's running a true, rigorous, human-centered double diamond or fighting through postmodern discourses, it's exhausting. It is frustrating, iterative, and incredibly demanding on a team. You should never waste that premium cognitive energy on a simple logistical task that just requires a checklist.
Just as you shouldn't use lazy linear checklists to manage a novel crisis.
Right. The meta decision protects your team's mental bandwidth so they have the energy to design when design is actually required.
So what does this all mean? Let's zoom out and look at the territory we've covered today. We started with the Sinefin framework, giving us a map to separate the simple and complicated realities from the complex and chaotic ones.
The foundation.
Then we explored how military institutions realize that rigid planning fails against hostile reciprocity, an adversary actively morphing the rules of the game. We saw how Shemanova and 6 students proved that operational design and reframing the problem beats blindly executing a plan.
A huge paradigm shift.
And we untacked the actual tools, Human-centered design for finding empathy in divergent solutions, and postmodern design for brutally questioning whether the reality we're looking at is just a simulation. The ultimate takeaway from Blombal's research is that in a world of constant dynamic change, our greatest asset is not a rigid, color-coded plan. It's the agility of our thinking.
Absolutely.
It's the willingness to pause, look at the chaos, and ask, are we even using the right mental tool for this reality?
This raises an important question, though, as we look toward the future. We have spent this entire deep dive focusing on human cognition. We've talked about human teams using critical reflection, multidisciplinary collaboration, and empathy to outdesign the hostile reciprocity of other humans.
I know where you're going with this. We're talking about the introduction of artificial intelligence.
Yeah. What happens to the Cinefin framework when autonomous AI enters the battlefield or the global financial markets or the corporate strategy room? When an algorithmic adversary can analyze a complex environment, adapt, mutate, and generate hostile reciprocity at a speed that is literally faster than human cognition.
Where does that leave the defense design teams?
Exactly. Will our human-centered design, with its careful divergent and convergent diamonds and emphasis on empathy, be our saving grace because it preserves our humanity and connects us to the reality on the ground? Or will the sheer, overwhelming speed of the machine push the entire human world permanently into the chaotic domain, a state where no human plan, discourse, or design can ever catch up?
Wow. It fundamentally reframes the whole conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, if that meticulously planned project falls apart the minute you start because a human changed a few variables, what happens when an AI changes the variables a million times a second?
It's a whole new world.
The jagged line on the radar isn't just murky anymore. The radar itself is redesigning its own purpose while you look at it. Something to mull over until our next deep dive.